Okay, hi everyone. In this PowerPoint, we're going to look at 3 different ways in which substances can move in and out of cells. 2 of them are passive, 1 of them is active. We'll look at that in a minute. The 3 different ways we're going to look at are called diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So to begin with, I just want to pose a question. Why can you smell things from a distance? You could understand if something was pressed against your nose, how you could probably smell it. But why could you still smell something, even if it's not pressed against your nose, even if it's 6 feet away, 10 feet away, the other side of the classroom? Why can you still smell that thing? Okay, whether that be a nice thing or a not so pleasant thing, you will still be able to smell it at some point. And why is that? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. Well, in this instance, we've got a smelly sock. The reason the person who's not even that close to the smelly sock can smell it is because actually there are particles in the air, and these are tiny particles, we can't see them usually, which will carry the smell. So that might be sweat, that might be little bits of, in fact, particles of the smell itself, in effect, and they can make their way through the air from the sock across the classroom to the other person who then be able to smell it, as you can see this guy here. Now, it will always spread out, and that process of spreading out is called diffusion, okay? And it happens all around us, it happens all the time, okay? But in that instance there, if you looked at that picture, where would the smell be the strongest? Well, the smell would be the strongest nearer the sock, okay? The closer you get to the sock, the stronger the smell would be. And that reason is simply because the smell has spread out the least there. It's more together, it's more concentrated in the area nearer the sock, and therefore the smell will be stronger, okay? So the smell's strongest at the sock, the smells become weaker the further away you go from the sock. Okay, so that's diffusion. It's simply spreading out of molecules. So we'll look at it in a little bit more detail now, but we'll think about where might diffusion occur, all right? So if you think about the 3 main states of matter, you've got solid, you've got liquid, and you've got gas. In order for diffusion to occur, you need to have particles that are able to move and bump into each other and spread out. And we'll look at that in a sec. So out of these 3 states, solid, liquid, and gas, you're going to see diffusion occur in liquid, and you're going to see diffusion occur in gas. That's simply because in those 2 states, the particles are able to move, whereas in a solid, the particles are in fixed position, they're not able to move, therefore they're not able to spread out, and therefore diffusion can't occur. So here is an example of those invisible particles I was talking about at the start, diffusing, spreading out. Now, if I reset this, okay, imagine here, if I set this going, that these are smell particles, okay? It's not a particularly scientific term, but imagine that they are smell particles, all right? And at the minute they're contained, there's this dividing line down the middle. So that could be a pleasant smell, could be perfume or aftershave inside a bottle, okay? Now, because it's a liquid or a gas, those particles are free to move, and you can see they're banging into one another. They're all on that one side, and they're contained. But if you do something to remove that containment, so for example, you spray your aftershave, deodorant, whatever it is, or you take the lid off something which smells, what you're going to see is that these particles are going to want to spread out. Okay, so if I remove this divider, all of a sudden, they're free to move. Now, they don't uniformly move in one direction, from the left to the right. They go in random directions, okay, and they bang into one another. But what you find is, I'll just stop that there. Even though I let them just release, I let them randomly move in each direction, I let them bang into one another, I just put that divider back in just at any point. And okay, it's not exactly even. It's not 10-10 on either side, because there are 20 particles there, but it's 11 and 9. And that's because things tend to spread out until they're pretty much even, okay? Let's have a look at what we call that. So, actually, if I looked at this, which is with 2 gases, okay, so you've got 10 orange on the right, you've got 10 green on the left. If I'll set it going again, once again, we've got a divider, so all the greens are on the left, all the oranges on the right. If I allow them to mix by removing the divider, and then let them mix around for a while, so they're diffusing, the greens are diffusing to the right, the oranges are diffusing to the left, and actually we reach a point where it's pretty even. And now, overall, the numbers of greens and oranges, in fact, it just stopped 5, 5, 5, 5. The number of greens and oranges is completely equal on both sides. Now, that doesn't mean that the oranges have stopped moving left, and it doesn't mean that the greens have stopped moving right. What it means is The oranges are moving left at the same speed as the greens are moving right, and they're moving back and forth, oranges left and right, greens left and right at the same rate. We call that equilibrium. So although I could have stopped that divider, and there might not have been completely equal oranges and greens on either side, on average, once you've allowed them to diffuse and mix with one another, you'll have, on average, an equal number of oranges and greens on each side. Okay, that's known as equilibrium. So during diffusion, molecules move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Think back to the first animation that I showed there with the green particles. They were highly concentrated on the left-hand side. They were contained in a container. But when I removed the divider, they moved from that concentrated area and they spread out to the right-hand side. Now, they did that until they were fairly equal all over. Now, that didn't mean, like I said, that they stop moving left to right, stop moving. They don't just all freeze when they get equal. They carry on moving left and right, but overall, on average, there's an equal concentration everywhere. Now, the difference in concentration between an area of high concentration and an area of low concentration, we call a concentration gradient, okay? So in this diagram here, we have a higher concentration on the left. We call that high concentration. We can see there's a higher concentration because there simply are more particles. And on the right, that's a lower concentration simply because there are fewer particles. And when diffusion occurs, particles will always move from where there's more of them, a higher concentration, to where there are fewer of them, a lower concentration, okay? And that's called going with the concentration gradient. Now, that just happens. We don't have to give a smelly sock some energy in order for the smell to spread out. It will do it on its own. Because of that, because it doesn't require any energy, and it just happens without anybody doing anything, we call it a passive process. It means that no energy is needed. And they will continue to do that, like I said, until equilibrium is reached. That means it's roughly equal on both sides. Now, I'll just reiterate, that doesn't mean diffusion stops. That doesn't mean that the particles stop moving. Particles continue to move, but they're just roughly even spread, and the same number move one way as they'll move the other way. Okay, so they're evenly spread, and we call that equilibrium. All right. Now, diffusion can happen at different speeds. It can happen according to that speed can be affected by a number of different things, and one of the main ones is how far the particles have to travel. So if they only have to travel a short distance, diffusion is going to happen really quickly. If they have to travel a long distance, that happen more slowly. So, for example, if I spray some aftershave in one corner of the lab, the people who were sat near where I sprayed it would smell that aftershave first, and the people who were sat on the other side of the lab would smell that aftershave later on. Or in some cases, they might not smell it at all, and that's simply because it's got to diffuse over a further distance to get to the people who are on the other side of the lab, as compared to the people who were sat near to where I would have sprayed the aftershave. So diffusion happens more quickly over a shorter distance. So here's some true or false questions, some statements, about diffusion. I'm going to pause here, and I would just like you to have a go at answering these questions. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to pause the video, have a go at answering those, and I'll go through some answers in a moment. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers, see if you got them right. Molecules are able to diffuse because they're constantly moving around. Yes, that one's true. Only molecules in liquids and gases can diffuse. That one's also true. Don't forget, if molecules can't move, you can't have diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. That's false. They move from where it's highly concentrated to where it's low concentration. Molecules move down a concentration gradient during diffusion. That's true. We say it's moving down the concentration gradient. We might also say it moves with the concentration gradient. Sometimes you'll see it written, but it means the same thing. Molecules diffuse until they're evenly spaced apart. That's true. And diffusion requires energy. That's false. It's a passive process. Okay. All right. So moving on. I'm going to look at now. I'm not going to look at all of these because you'll look at some of them in different lessons. But I'm going to look at some examples of where diffusion happens. Okay. Because it's important to not only know what diffusion is, but also be able to say, okay, here's an example of a diffusion in action. Okay. So if you think, first of all, of our blood vessels. Okay. So you should know by now, I hope, that blood is a transport medium. It's a liquid which carries all the things we need to survive in our body. So those things in the main are oxygen and food or glucose, nutrients. Okay, but it also carries waste products as well. But if you're carrying oxygen, let's say, and you're carrying food, you're carrying glucose, and you're carrying it because you want to take it to cells where it can be used, but it's in the blood vessels. So how does it get from the blood vessels to the cells? Okay, well, the answer is diffusion. Okay, If you have a concentration gradient, and don't forget that's a difference in concentration between one area and another, then things naturally want to spread out to become even, to reach equilibrium. Right? So if you've got a high concentration of oxygen in your blood, high concentration of food and nutrients in your blood, and you're a blood vessel carrying blood to some cells and they don't have a high concentration of oxygen or nutrients, then the oxygen and the nutrients is naturally going to want to leave the blood, diffuse out of it, and go to the cells where the concentration is low. And it will carry on doing that until the concentration of the oxygen and the nutrients is equal in the blood and in the cells. Okay, so there's a really good example of where it happens. In blood vessels known as capillaries, oxygen, nutrients can be dropped off, delivered to cells by diffusion. Okay, and at the same time, those cells have probably produced some waste products while they've been doing their cellular activities, and the blood that's arriving has probably got quite a low amount of waste products in. I'm thinking about carbon dioxide here. So the waste products from the cells are going to want to diffuse the opposite way. They're going to want to go into the capillaries, into the blood, so those waste products can be taken away from the cells and excreted somewhere else, probably the lungs. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell too much on where else this happens. It does also happen in the lungs, in the alveoli. Okay, so here's an alveoli. It's the air sacs in your lungs. It's the way in which we get oxygen into our blood. The same thing we just discussed happening at all the cells in the body, even the capillaries, happens at the alveoli in our lungs. But in this case, we're taking oxygen into the blood and we're moving carbon dioxide out of the blood. Okay, but you will look at that in more detail in your lessons on the respiratory system. Okay, so I'm not well too much on that now. And also you'll look at the adaptations to help that happen faster as well in your lessons about the respiratory system. Okay, but here's another example of where it happens. If we think about food, okay, digestion is simply breaking up food into small enough molecules that it can be absorbed into our blood. But that's the key point there, absorbed into our blood. Because as we've just looked, we need that food, that nutrients in our blood so we can deliver it to our cells. Okay, but how does it get into our blood in the first place? Well, once we've digested it, we've broken it down into small enough molecules. So that starts with us chewing things, and then it happens with enzymes breaking those molecules down into really small individual building blocks, as we see here. That's what's happening there with that protein. Once they're into their small building blocks, then they can be diffused into our bloodstream. And where does that happen? Well, it happens in our small intestine. So another good example of where diffusion takes place is inside our small intestine to absorb food into our blood. Okay, once it's been broken down into small enough molecules that we can absorb it into our bloodstream. Okay, so there's another good example. So we've got in the lungs and in the capillaries and in our digestive system so far, and these are all for diffusion still. The reason I'm showing that concentration one of the small intestine is because it comes up again later when we're looking at something a little bit different. So I just want to make sure we got that one in. So here it happens because there's a high concentration of food inside your gut, inside your small intestine, and there's a low concentration of food in the blood that's in your intestine wall. So of course we know diffusion goes from high concentration to low concentration. Therefore it will move from your inside of your gut to your blood, which is in your intestine wall. Okay, but that doesn't always happen, and we'll look at that in a sec. Another place it happens is the placenta. So we can diffuse nutrients and stuff from the mother to the baby via the placenta, which is stuck to the wall of the womb or the uterus. Okay, things diffuse over. That can be good things like food and nutrients. It can also be bad things like viruses and alcohol and things like that. So it's why it's important to look after yourself when you're pregnant. We're not on that one though. The other place it happens is in all of your nerve endings. So where a nerve meets a nerve, you have something called a synapse. You can see one nerve ending here, another nerve beginning here. Now you probably know that nerves carry electrical impulses, so they carry electricity, if you like, along them. But when one nerve joins another nerve, there's a gap, and you can't have an electrical impulse jumping across a gap. You can't have little sparks fired off all over your body. So what you have instead is called neurotransmitters, these little chemicals. So it arrives as an electrical signal, gets turned into a chemical. That chemical diffuses across this gap, across the synaptic cleft. Okay, so here's a nerve, here's another nerve. There's a gap in between called a synapse. We don't have electricity jumping across. Chemicals instead go across, and they go across, of course, by diffusion. Now, luckily, these gaps are really, really small, so diffusion happens really, really quickly in the synapse. But there's another example. So we've got oxygen and nutrients moving in and out of the body. We've got the digestive system, absorption of nutrients from food, and then you've got you've got neurotransmitters moving across the synaptic cleft where one nerve meets another. Okay, so there's really good examples of diffusion in action inside the human body. Okay, what about osmosis? So osmosis, thankfully, is very similar to diffusion. It doesn't require any energy. It only needs to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. The difference is it's specifically talking about water. So you could almost say in some respects, osmosis is simply the diffusion of water. Okay, and you'd be almost right. There are a couple of extra things you need to include, but on the whole, you'd be pretty right on that. Now, the reason you won't be entirely right is because osmosis requires some kind of semi-permeable membrane. So whereas diffusion, you could have a smelly sock and it can just spread across the classroom. In osmosis, there's got to be some kind of barrier in the middle, and the water diffuses. The osmosis of water happens through that barrier. Okay, so it isn't exactly the same as just simply saying the diffusion of water, but it's not far off. So you might have seen this demonstration. You might have also done the practical for this, where you've got cut bits of potato and you put them in sugary solution or salty solution, and then you put them in pure water, and you look what happens. Osmosis is the movement of water. Okay, now here, water is represented by the little blue dots. Now there are more little blue dots on the right-hand side than there are on the left-hand side. That means the concentration of water is higher on the right-hand side than it is on the left-hand side. Now don't forget, it's a passive process. It's like diffusion. So the movement of water molecules goes from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. And the difference between it and diffusion is this barrier here. This is called a semi-permeable membrane or a partially permeable membrane. In this case, it's some visqueen tubing, but this could be the outside of your piece of potato. And that's got to be involved in osmosis. The water's got to move through that semi-permeable membrane. Now, you might be saying, well, there's more of these red things here. Now, these could be starch, they could be salt. There's more of these red things here than there are here. So surely the red things want to diffuse from left to right. And you'd be absolutely right in saying that. The only reason that's not happening is this membrane, this barrier here, is partially permeable. That means it only lets some things through that are small enough and not other things. And these red things, whether they're starch, salt, whatever they are simply too big to go that way. So they remain in there because they're too big to fit through the holes to move from left to right. Okay. Okay. So the thing where you got a little bit unstuck here is if I put a row of different, let's say, squashes or cordials out, and I said, or I was making a glass of squash, and I said, how do you like it? Do you like it dilute or concentrated? You would say the one that had the most amount of, let's say, orange squash in is the most concentrated. And it is. That's the most concentrated amount of orange squash. But it's also the one that's got the least concentration of water in it. So don't forget, when we're talking about osmosis, we're talking about the concentration of water. So something which is very dilute has a high concentration of water, and something which is very sort of strong has a low concentration of water. So things will move from where they're more watery, high concentration of water, to where they're less watery, which is a lower concentration of water. Okay. And sometimes because when we're talking in everyday life about things being concentrated, we tend to mean the things which are concentrated with things other than water, like squash, for example. You can be a bit confused there. So don't forget, the most watery things have the highest concentration of water. So the thing with the highest concentration of water is, of course, pure water, distilled water. You cannot get any more watery than pure water. So that's the thing with the highest concentration of water. And things which don't have much water in, so for example, a really sugary or salty solution, they've got a low concentration of water. Okay, so important to bear in mind. We're just talking about how concentrated is the water when we're talking about osmosis. Okay, so here are some examples. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds on each one to think about. We've got some water here, blue dots. We've got some water here, blue dots. And we've got some glucose, which are these red hexagons. And we've got a partially permeable membrane. Now, the water is going to want to move from either left to right or right to left. Or it's going to say, actually, we're pretty even and going to leave it. And what I'd like to do for each one is to say whether it's going to move from left to right or right to left, or whether there's going to be no net movement. That means the water's it's pretty happy where it is. It's already pretty much in equilibrium, all right? So let's look at this first one. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to answer it. Do you think the water's going to move from this way to that way, so right side to left side? Is it going to move from left side to right side? Or is there going to be no net movement? And I'll give you a little hint. Try counting the number of little blue dots. Try counting the number of little red hexagons as well, okay? So I'll just give you a second to decide which way that water is going to move. Okay, so this water is going to move away, all right? And the reason it's going to move that way is there are more water molecules this side than there are that side. So there's a higher concentration of water this side than there are that side. Forget things want to spread out until they're even. So in order to do that, some of the water molecules are going to have to move from the right side to the left side, okay? What about this one? I'll give you a couple of seconds to pause the video and decide whether it's going to go from left to right or right to left. Okay, so hopefully you had to think about that one. Now this one's a bit more difficult because if you're just counting the blues, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blues on the right side, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blues on the left side. So you might think, okay, maybe there's no net movement. But actually, there are more glucose on this side. There are 3 as compared to 1 on this side, and therefore the left-hand side has a high concentration of water because the right-hand side has a high concentration of glucose. And so the overall net movement of water will be from left to right like that. Final one then. Have a little think about that. Given what we said about number of blues, number of reds, decide whether you think there's going to be a net movement to the left, a net movement to the right, or no net movement at all. I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at that. Pause the video here. Okay, so if we take the method of counting the blues again, we've got 5 blues that side, 5 blues that side, and then counting the reds, we've got 3 reds that side, 3 reds that side. That tells me that whether you're looking at the glucose or the water, there's an equal concentration on both sides, and therefore where you've got an equal concentration on both sides, there's going to be no net movement. Now that doesn't mean that water molecules won't go from right to left and won't go from left to right. They will. What it does mean is, on average, the same number will go from right to left as will go from left to right. So overall, you won't notice a change. There'll be no net movement. Okay, that's what that's. All right. So what happens to water molecules during osmosis? This is similar to what I was showing you with diffusion. If you look, again, we've got this random movement of molecules. They bump into each other. They move in all directions. And if you look at how we started with no glucose side, no glucose side. The glucose aren't going to be able to pass through this permeable membrane. So there are always going to be 3 on the left. But the water molecules, okay, what we should see over time is that every once in a while a couple go through, like that one just snuck through. And sometimes they sneak back, so one just snuck back there. But more often than not, because there's more water this side, you'll see more sneaking through that side. So you can see they're starting to even out. Now it's 9 and 11. It's not a million miles away from being equal. And if we left it, it's 10. Okay, it's actually gone over to 11 and 9 here. But what you'd see, you'd reach a point where roughly the same number going from right to left as we're going from left to right, and the water would be equal on both sides. And that's what it's trying to do. Same with diffusion. Things are always trying to spread out and make themselves equal. Okay. So let's have a look at some instances where osmosis happens in living things. Okay. Plant cell, here's an animal cell. Okay. Now they both have a cell membrane. You know that from early science. But the difference is, don't forget, plant cells have a cell wall. Okay. And so it's important. Whoops. When we're looking at this, okay, because the cell wall actually offers some protection. So if you look at I've got a control here that I can change the water concentration outside the cell. So if I had a high concentration of water outside the cell, that means water is going to want to go into the cell to make the cell more watery, because it's more watery outside the cell than it is inside the cell. And let's have a look at what that's going to do to the cell. Makes it swell up. Okay, we say that the plant cell is turgid. It's swollen up, but thankfully, it's still pretty much retained its shape, and it will still function as a cell, even though it's got a lot of water inside. If I reduce water concentration outside the cell, water is going to leave the plant cell and it's going to go to the outside of the cell where there isn't a high concentration of water. Now, what that causes to happen is this. Water's left the cell because there's less water in the surrounding tissue, and the cytoplasm has pulled away from the cell wall. We say that it's plasmalized, okay? But, okay, it's slightly out of shape, but it's pretty much got its shape still. But if you did this to a plant, you will have probably seen this. The plant will go a bit floppy. It will wilt, okay? Because it doesn't have that. It's not full of water and nice and turgid and rigid and able to hold up the plant anymore. And you'll see that the plant will go kind of floppy, okay? Now, animal cells don't have a cell wall. So what happens when you put them in a really watery solution? Well, unfortunately, because they don't have a cell wall to keep all the water in, if you put an animal cell into distilled water, pure water, the water is going to go into the cell because it wants to make it even everywhere. But if too much water goes into an animal cell, it doesn't have that cell wall to protect it. and it will end up bursting, okay? And we call it lysis. So it's really dangerous for any of our cells in our body to be in too much of a watery environment. And that's in fact the reason that water in too great amounts is actually toxic for us, okay? If you had too much water in your body, it'll cause some of your cells to burst, and obviously that's not a good thing. And the opposite takes place. We call it crenation. If there's not enough water, the water leaves your cells and they start to kind of shrivel up and lose their shape once again. You wouldn't really want either of happening to your cells too much, but you certainly wouldn't want your cells to be bursting due to too high water concentration outside of them. So we see that happening here. Low water concentration, we've got this crenation, they lose their shape. High water concentration, you see it swelling. There's a limit what the cell membrane can take, and if you go past that limit, it will burst. Okay, and that cell's useless now. That cell's destroyed. You've caused yourself some proper damage. All right. So what actually needs to happen is we need to keep this balance called isotonic. Isotonic means it's got the same concentration outside the cell as inside the cell, and that stops the cell taking up too much water and bursting, or not taking enough water and shriveling up and crenating and losing its shape. Okay, so we talk about having an isotonic water balance. Okay, so that's diffusion, that's active transport. Just to sort of summarize where we are so far, they're both passive processes. That means they don't require energy, so they both just happen on their own. And they're both processes that go with or down the concentration gradient. So they go from where things are highly concentrated, they start off, they spread out to where they're low concentrated until it's all even, and we call that equilibrium. Both of those mechanisms do that. So they're passive and they go with or down the concentration gradient. Okay, active transport that we're going to look at now is slightly different because it works against the concentration gradient. Things that are already in low concentration here will move to somewhere where there's already a high concentration, which seems kind of odd, really. But we'll look at what it is. Now, moving up or against the concentration gradient, it even sounds it's hard. Okay, you're going against the natural order of things. Rather than things spread out, you're almost sucking things together. So you've got all of the concentration in one place. Now, because that's not a natural process, that's not a passive process, it's something that's hard to do, it requires energy. Okay, so that's why the name active transport as opposed to passive comes from. It means that it needs energy in order for it to happen. Okay, now it won't just happen through gases and liquids and through semi-permeable membranes like it does in diffusion and osmosis. You need something else to help you do it. So you have these things called carrier or transport proteins, and you can see one here. If you imagine this is the cell membrane, this yellow section here, you will have these transport proteins studied into your cell membrane at varying intervals, and what they allow you to do is this. So if we look inside the cell here, whatever this green thing is, these green molecules here, there are more of them inside the cell than outside the cell. So you would expect, if you went with the concentration gradient, these green things to go through the membrane and out of the cell. Okay, and if it were diffusion or osmosis, that is what would happen. But sometimes we want to get every last bit of whatever this green particle is. And so we have these carrier proteins. They will attract the desired particle that you want. They will fit into a particular site on that protein. We'll give that protein some energy. As you can see, this is the absolute key part. The protein changes shape. Now it took in the desired molecule from the outside of the cell. It accepted some energy and it changed shape and it released the desired molecule on the inside of the cell. So what have we done overall? Well, we've added an extra green molecule here, whatever that is. Okay, we've added an extra green one. There was already a low concentration outside the cell. There was already a high concentration of green inside the cell. But through giving this protein some energy, we've changed it from an even lower concentration there. We've made it an even higher concentration inside the cell. We've gone against the concentration gradient. That's active transport. Okay. And where does this happen? Well, this happens in plants. Plants have got to be greedy. They've got to take all of the nutrients that they can do. Okay. So if you're talking about things such as nitrates, phosphorus, potassium, they need every bit that they can get. Okay. So they would use active transport in their roots to make sure that they take up all the minerals that they can. So a good example of active transport is in the roots of plants to take up minerals. Okay, they don't need to do this for water because water happens with osmosis, but they do need to do this for minerals. Okay, so an example of active transport in plants is the uptake of minerals through the roots. It also happens in humans, though. If you cast your mind back to when I was talking about the small intestine, I said there's loads of glucose or loads of food particles inside your intestine, so it can just diffuse into the blood in your intestine wall. But that would only happen until there was the same concentration of food particles in the gut as in the blood. And then diffusion would stop because you've reached equilibrium. But we don't do that. We don't just, okay, we've got half of the nutrients out of our food, that'll do, and we let the other half pass through our digestive system. We want to get all of the nutrients out of our food. So what we do is, even when the concentration gets higher in our blood than it is inside our gut, what do we do then? We use active transport. We use active transport to take the last bits of nutrients from inside our gut to make sure we're getting all of it. So we're concentrating all the nutrients in one place. And where is that one place? It's in the blood that supplies our small intestine. In that way, we've collected all the nutrients from the food. So, just to summarize, diffusion and osmosis are both passive. That means that they require no energy. They will happen anyway. They're just basically the process of spreading out due to particles moving, randomly bumping into one another until they're roughly equal on both sides or in two areas, okay? We call that spreading out, working with or down the concentration gradient, move from a high concentration to a low concentration. Active transport, which is the third one, is special in a couple of ways. One, it will work against the concentration gradient for you. It will take things from where there's not very many of them, and it will concentrate them all in one area where you really want them. That's called working against or up the concentration gradient. But in order to do that, it's an active process, and therefore it requires energy. Okay. All right. I hope that was clear enough. Obviously, if it isn't, then you've all got my email.